Hello, this is Svenza, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about science today. For those of you accessing this from Waldorf Direct, I'm trying to catch up the lecture that was interrupted due to the power cut in my village. And that's rather appropriate, given that it was during a science lesson that this happened, because just when we were interrupted, I was talking about being interested in the things that happen around us and asking ourselves why. Why do they happen? I've called this session Don't Be Afraid of Curiosity, because I would like to argue that the single greatest asset we have as modern human beings is our capacity to be curious, never-endingly curious, in fact. So in this context of teaching and learning about science at school, I'd like to briefly think about why we do this and then how we do this, and then also maybe say a few things that will take away the fear that some of us have inherited from being taught science at school ourselves. So this will take no more than half an hour, I should think. So to begin with, I would like to just look inward for a moment at the human soul and consider that with our soul life, we have three ways of relating to the world. The first of those is a simple responsive function. So I go outside and I'm not wearing a coat and I feel cold. So the sensation of cold is a response to the temperature outside. And in many different ways, that was a very simple example, I relate to the world in that way. Something comes flying towards me and I blink, or I feel sad when something happens that triggers me in that way. So those are responses and relatively unreflected natural responses to things that are coming towards me as impulses from the outside. The second level, if you want, to respond to the world is one of understanding. So I'm not receiving everything new all the time, like some people say goldfish do, but I learn. So I have a response, reaction to something, and the next time I'm trying to use that experience to do something about it. So for example, having been caught out cold outside, I will put on a coat next time because I understand that there's a pattern here. I've learned the patterns of the times of the year, for example, and I've understood when something requires me to protect myself, then I can find ways of doing that. So this understanding part of my soul recognizes patterns that it has looked for, identifies them, and then enters into a more active part of relationship with the world. So beyond the purely responding to impulses, I can now actually make things happen because I understand the rules by which things can happen in the natural world. So this is the second level, if you like. And the third level then is one of awareness. What that means is that once I know what the rules are, I can begin to question those rules. Because the framework of rules governing my soul life is subject to change. In science, that would be called follow the evidence. Because as I grow up, and that's true both for me individually as for humanity as a whole, I realize that the parameters that tell me something is true might be subject to change and shifting. I'll give you an example. I'm standing at 5:30 or so in the morning in my garden, and it's beginning to get bright. That's initially something that the response part of my soul is taking stock of, taking care of, noticing, amalgamating, responding to with feelings and with maybe the urge to be active or something like that. So daytime is beginning. And then I see the sun rising above the horizon. And this happens every morning. And so I can think, okay, the sun wasn't there a moment ago, and now it's turning up. So this seems to be happening in a regularity. And sure enough, next day that is borne out. So my understanding part of the soul now says, that happens every morning. So I'm going to call that the sunrise. And For the last 500 years, we've known that this concept isn't actually accurate, that the sun is not, in fact, rising above the horizon, but that the Earth is tilting towards the sun, and specifically the place on the Earth on which I stand is hurtling towards the sun at 400 meters per second, and that's why it looks as if the sun is rising. However, 500 years haven't been enough for the awareness part of my soul to tell the understanding part of my soul to change the word. So we still call it a sunrise in every country in the world. And it shows the power of the entrenched, if you like, thinking. So science has known for a long time, and science parameters, just like societal parameters, are subject to change. And it's my awareness of the great big context that can allow that to happen and can let go of old patterns of understanding that might have held me back before. So I'm saying this partly to remind us that when we're dealing with science, we're not dealing with absolute truths. The first thing is that I experience the world, and that I then begin to try and understand it, and then use that concept in order to attain some kind of agency as a human being. And stuff happens to us all the time. Are we encouraging ourselves? Are we allowing ourselves and encouraging our pupils to be curious about that and ask questions? So let me start this slideshow then a little bit and give you a list of words, a list of activities, in fact: cooking, painting, digging, building, shopping, driving, crying, standing, breathing. What do they all have in common? Well, we can do all those things long before we understand how they work. We don't need to understand the concept. We have an urge, we follow that urge and do an activity, and only much, much later do we then analyze that and find out by what laws this is happening. And that leads me to pick up a particular context from an anthroposophical lecture by Rudolf Steiner. However, what I'm going to bring to you is not pure anthroposophy, it's actually pure common sense. But it's an absolutely essential building block, a generative principle, one might say, of Waldorf education. And in most people's conceptual vocabulary, this is known as the three-stage rhythm. In lecture 9 of his foundational course to new teachers, Rudolf Steiner describes this. And he says the first thing that happens to us is that we have an experience. Something happens to us and we need to respond to that. Then we try and throw the light of understanding to that to create a context. What is happening to us right now? What can we compare that to? And as a result, then we can arrive at a new concept which we didn't have before. Rudolf Steiner uses the experience of meeting a lion for the first time for this. Oh, excuse me, I'm going to go back a little bit. Oh. So if I've never seen a lion before, but I know what a cat is, then I can use my previously existing concept of a cat to contextualize the lion. That is much bigger and much more dangerous. So I'm probably going to climb up a tree to make sure. And once I've sort of established that I'm safe and I can think about this, I realize I now have a new concept. A kind of cat, but a dangerous one. A lion, in other words. And next time I go into another country and a large cat like that comes towards me, I can use my new concept of the lion to apply to that. He calls the 3 steps conclusion, judgment, and concept. I would like to replace those and modernize them slightly by saying I have an experience. I contextualize that experience with previous learning, and then I own a new concept I've grown inwardly and maybe outwardly as well. Now that seems like a lot of common sense, but in my school experience, my education did not follow this particular pattern. It didn't work like that for me, because my teachers, especially my science teachers, started at the other end. They came to me with a concept first, a concept such as this one. The speed of sound is the distance traveled per unit of time by a sound wave as it propagates through an elastic medium. At 20 degrees centigrade, the speed of sound in air is about 343 meters per second, or 1 kilometer in 2.91 seconds, or 1 mile in 4.69 seconds. So our teacher would make us write that off the blackboard into our books, and if he was so inclined, then take us outside with a great pair of wooden clappers to demonstrate it. So we'd go out on the football ground and he'd go to the other end of the running track and show us that, and then get very irate because we weren't paying attention. We were much more interested in chatting with each other, and we weren't the least bit interested in what he was trying to show us, not because we were naughty, but because he made an essential didactic mistake. He'd told us the answer before making us curious about the question. And this is an absolutely essential didactic element of Waldorf education. How much better would it have been had he taken us outside without telling us what was going to happen, and then given us that experience, which is really quite an extraordinary one, when you see the hands go together and it takes almost a second until you hear the clap. Now, if you've never seen that before in this way, that's quite oh wow, that was cool. I wonder what happened there. And then we could have gone back to the classroom and he could have entered into a conversation with us. So what do you think happened here? What did you see? Now, an essential element here in Waldorf school practice, is that we do have this conversation and then we go to sleep. We let it rest. We let it go and don't come back to it until the following day. The English thinking pioneer and the founder of the London School of Economics, Graham Wallas, he called that second stage incubation. Let it sink, let it go to sleep on it. You've had an experience, you've had some thoughts about it, but let it go. Play some football, have a nice dinner, go dancing, and then come back to it tomorrow and ask the question, okay, what might we have seen here? So that indicates, of course, the fact that sound travels. And the next question then might be, what speed might it travel at? And how can we find that out? So we begin to explore now. And the whole thing is fed by our curiosity. And this is really the essential element that I wanted to bring out here. So in this Waldorf Modern module, I asked people to then think about, what about the next concept? We've just gone through a demonstration of sound traveling in air. What about sound traveling in gases? In other gases, I mean. And what about in liquids? And what about in solids? Which one might be fastest, and how could we find out about that? And I asked the participants to exchange some ideas on how that could be explored, because this exchange of ideas is a much more exciting element of science teaching and science learning than the learning, the head learning, the rote learning of concepts. So experience first, then remember the experience, let it go to sleep, let it go through its incubation stage, then bring it back into a context and together arrive at a living concept of this. And in grade 6, when the children are 12, it's perfectly enough to know that sound travels. Don't need more than that. And if we can also find out that sound travels faster through liquid than through gases, then that's even a great bonus. Measuring those things can happen much later in the high school, I would say. Similarly, you could have quite a spectacular experience in the classroom where you model a mountain out of clay, put it in a big basin, and then hang an empty water bottle from the ceiling upside down with the bottom removed and lots of holes poked into the lid. You fill the water bottle, and so there's a gentle rain coming onto the mountain from above. And of course, what will happen is that the little hollow that you've left on top of the mountain will fill up and the water will overspill, first on all sides, but then it will more and more gravitate to one particular corner of the little hole, of the little pond. And gradually a river will trace its way down there. And if you keep this experiment going for days, I would suggest about 5 days would be a good time, then not only will the children see how a river finds its bed, but also all the material it brings to the bottom, where the big tray is, will gradually create a beach and an estuary. And regularly we empty out the water without disturbing the mud that is gathering at the bottom. And this is a very practical way, and quite an exciting way, of developing through activity, through experience, and through contextualization, a concept of erosion. For the second half of my contribution now, I would like to have a look at the role the human being plays in science. I'm sure you're all familiar with the narrative that we don't matter. The old Bishop Berkeley question, if a tree falls over in the forest and nobody hears it, does it still make a sound? It's a theological question, really, and he answers it with, yes, it does, because God hears it. He's a bishop after all. But seriously, what are we there for? We have to be a bit careful here that we don't become sentimental, I think. Because, of course, a physical phenomenon will look exactly the same whether I'm observing it or not. But to use that fact to create a narrative for children that tells children that actually you don't matter at all is profoundly unpedagogical, because it's essentially inhumane. There are some environmentalists right now who, for understandable ethical, moral reasons, say that the Earth would be much healthier if human beings had never evolved. You can see where they're coming from, but there's something profoundly misanthropic about that, because we are here. And what are we supposed to do about that? Surely you're not suggesting that we commit mass suicide. So what is the answer to this? And if I think about teaching 10-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old children, surely but the last thing they need to hear from me is that they don't matter, that they don't count, that their experience is meaningless. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for meaning. And I don't want to spoil it by interpreting it, but I find a lot of response in the words of the German poet Rilke, when he says that, I know that nothing has ever been real without my beholding it. All becoming has needed me. My looking ripens things. And if you're a scientist now, shaking his head, then maybe we'll just have to agree to differ. But there are some bits in education where my foremost aim is not to teach a subject, but to teach human beings. And this is what the human being needs to hear from me. In grade 4, there's a very popular block, and it's often called human and animal. And some people call it zoology, but I think that's a bit mistaken, because we're not looking at animals only in that block. We're looking at the human being, and we're trying to characterize what the human being is like, particularly in our threefoldness of head, trunk, and limbs, in comparison to the animal kingdom. And we come fairly quickly to one profound qualitative difference, not quantitative, but qualitative difference between us and all the animals, including the higher ones, and that is that we are in a permanent, unstable equilibrium on our two legs. We have uprightness, and the uprightness gives us these two, our favorite tools, our hands. And no other mammal has anywhere like the amount of control that we have over our front paws, over our hands. And we pay a price for that, because actually these are pretty clumsy compared to animal front paws, even ugly, I would say. Not particularly aesthetically pleasing, but incredibly versatile. And that would be, for me, one of the learning objectives of such a block, that I instill great awe and appreciation in the children about the character of those animals, each of the animals I'm going to bring, but at the same time give them a sense of breadth of the human being. We can't do anything as well as the animal. There's always, for every activity that we do, there's always going to be an animal that can do it better. But we can do far more things. And this is, I think, where in a Waldorf context, I would bring in art to express that. So rather than get them to learn by heart laws that express that, we learn a poem together, such as this one. What a thing unique and grand is the humble human hand. Its design is not as clever as the eagle's fearsome claw. Neither will its beauty ever match the tiger's velvet paw. But could eagles play recorder, dig the garden, knit a sock, write the alphabet in order, do up laces, fix a lock? Could a tiger build a table, drive a car, or fell a tree? Only human hands are able to do all those things, you see. We can cut a piece of paper, sew on buttons, throw a ball, light a candle with a taper, hang a picture on the wall. We can feed ourselves and others, work for those who need our care, and turn strangers into brothers when we lift our hands in prayer. That's the human being. I would like to show you briefly, with reference to a science block, another biology one, how we try to involve the human being, those human beings in front of us in the classroom, but also the human being in an abstract way in the narrative we bring to the children. So I'm choosing sex education here, although I won't be talking about sex in this brief extract. I'm more interested right now in the natural science aspect. So I'm going through the biological kingdoms in order to move towards the human being. And as this is a holistic experience, I'm trying to create something that combines science, art, creativity, and storytelling to create in the children a sense of wonder, a sense of beauty, positivity, awe, and curiosity. I wonder why, I wonder how, I wonder when. Those are all questions I want the children to have during the time that I work with them, and whether or not they will find the answer in my 3 weeks with them is actually secondary to this. So we, of course, feed their desire to understand. When we look at reproduction in the plant system, then they will need to understand pollination and use the correct terms and words for these things. The pistils, ovaries, anthers, and so on. Of course, we need to know what they are and what they do. However, at the same time, we can marvel at the fact that one of the key players in this game, the butterfly, is a little bit like a flower without roots. And the flower is a little bit like a butterfly with roots. If you allowed a flower to move, would it not be a little bit like a butterfly? And if a butterfly decided, I like it here, I'm going to stay. Might they turn into a flower? I'm being deliberately fanciful here, but I want the children to see that there is a really beautiful relationship between the plants and the insects, because the insects is where we're going to go next. And if you never do anything other than this, I'd love you to teach your children about the life cycle of the mayfly, because it is truly, truly awesome. I'm not going to now give you all the figures that you need to get that awesomeness, but just get this. A mayfly larva lives for between 18 and 24 months at the bottom of a river. And when it finally rises to the surface in the form of a fly, it flies around only for a few hours before stopping, shedding its skin, emerging again from its skin, and then flying off again. And at this point, it only has 3 or 4 hours left in which to find a mate. And then it mates. The male fertilizes the female's eggs. The female lays her eggs on the water, like this. And then the female floats down the river and dies. That makes a profound impression on children. What? Do you mean they've only lived for a day? And I say, yes, well, maximum a day and a half, but that's it. That's all they have. And they have, of course, had those 2 years underwater, but the children have already forgotten about those because this is just so extraordinary. And what happens to the male mayflies? Well, the male mayflies do this. This is a town near the Mississippi. And those are male mayflies who now fly being attracted to light, as many nocturnal insects are. And they have literally minutes left to live. And the next morning, the whole town looks like that. And this being the United States, it all gets bulldozed away and is terribly smelly. In other parts of the world, in Nigeria, for example, this gets collected much more carefully, dried out, ground into flour, and then becomes a wonderful source of protein for millions of people. So we have this amazing thing about what we might call life cycles, and the children are really intrigued by this. And the closer we get to where we are in the animal kingdoms, the easier it is to have genuine empathy. So you have the baby salmon here being born in a Scottish stream, and they gradually make their way to the estuary, and then they become saltwater fish and go into the Atlantic. And not just near Scotland, but they go into the Atlantic near Iceland. Between Iceland, Greenland, and the Canadian coasts, that's where their fishing grounds are, their feeding grounds. And they grow into quite substantial fish. The Atlantic salmon are quite big, you can see that here. And then they return, and not just to Scotland, but to their own native stream, which is absolutely awesome. And you can already hear between my fairly prosaic words that here's a narrative for a 40 or 50-minute presentation to 12-year-old students, 12-year-old pupils, and how fascinated they would become at this. And they have to go all the way upstream, which means that they have to negotiate waterfalls, they have to negotiate locks, and it's very tricky and very dangerous. Look how exposed these salmon are, where they have to try and work their way upstream through very, very shallow rivers now, because there's a drought here that they have to battle. And of course, their predators know this, and they are going to stand in those particular places when those weakened fish on their way to spawning, maybe just 500 meters from the place where they would be safe, they get caught after a journey of thousands of miles. And now it's churning in the soul of the 12-year-old. And what have I done? I've taught science through feeling. And I make no apologies for that. Because I've not said anything that's not true. I've not sentimentalized anything. I've not used cute names or anything like that. I've told straight facts, but in narrative form, and so that they appeal to the feeling life of the child. And the child becomes the salmon and the child becomes the bear, because at this point, this is what matters. It's my connection. If I don't have that, science becomes this alien concept from which I find it easy to detach, like I did when I was a child. Had I heard silence like this, in a narrative way, then my heart would have opened to it, and I could have also coped with something like this. At the end, then, of this narrative process, I can look at the relationship between parents and children in the plant world, the insects, the amphibians, and so on, until I come to the humans. And we realize, okay, parents and children have a much more conscious relationship the closer we come to where we are, the place that we occupy in the mammal kingdom. And we finish really with this point here, and this is something that animals, even the highest developed ones, can't really do, to have a conscious view on our biography. So I asked the children to write down one thing in their lives. One thing that happened when I was 11, when I was 10, when I was 9, and so on. And of course, they run out of memory by the time they get to 4 or something like that. So they have to ask at home. When did I start walking? What was my first word? And how was I as a baby? And how was I in your tummy? How did you and my father actually meet? And so on and so on. Yeah. So we are going deep now into this human biography, having created the context, and all those little stories I told, all those were experiences. Experience doesn't mean I'd have to have something to look at. It doesn't have to be experiments or demonstrations. They can also be soul experiences. And then we contextualize and we arrive at concepts. It works just the same in this way. So I'm basically at the end of my contribution that I wanted to bring to you. So this element of the human being an important one in this. And I want to bring you one more brief example from a context of astronomy. You see, astronomy is maybe one scientific subject about which more arguments have taken place than any other one, partly because they have such profound consequences for religion. So the arguments about the geocentric or heliocentric worldview, for example, the various things that happened in the context of new discoveries. And we're just coming to the place now in our modern human life in the 21st century that certain discoveries with deep space telescopes throw a big question on what has been considered the latest word in evolutionary science, and that is the Big Bang. So the origins of our universe are not quite as clear, are not quite as certain as they were 20 years ago. And this is what I was speaking about earlier on. It's time maybe for understanding to once more give way to awareness. And I'd like to bring in Walt Whitman here. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick. Till, rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. Wouldn't it be profound if, as teachers, we reintroduced the permission to dream for our pupils? When we allowed once more a consciousness that it's not all about understanding, that even in something that appears so clear-cut as science. Understanding is a step on the way to awareness of the world, to interest and love for the world, yes, but one that is fed equally by direct experience, by a feeling connection, and by the light of thinking. So this is what I wanted to bring to you today. And I'm sorry it couldn't happen as live as I wanted it in the World of Modern context, but maybe this one will have to do for now. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm looking forward to reconnecting with you on another topic sometime soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.